how does all of your projections and look forward influenced by this huge deficit spending that's been going on the last few years? I mean, it has to have a big play on a lot of this stuff. I mean, I think we're at $25 trillion when you throw in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I mean, it's enormous. Does it have to be factored in somewhere?
Yeah. So the answer is yes. It gets factored into multiple different ways. The presence of a large debt that's in place certainly matters. Now, how does that matter? You know, it matters in the short term. Spending provides stimulus. You know, it leads to increases in GDP. Over the longer term, taxes will have to be raised to pay for that. And the uncertainty, I think, about when and how those taxes will be raised, I think does have a drag as well on the economy. So there's these offsetting influences that you have to take into account in the forecast. My benchmark forecast is one that does its best to try to incorporate all these elements, but obviously that is part of what introduces the uncertainties that I described.
Related to Tom's question is the fiscal cliff that could occur the end of this year, with the Bush tax cut set to expire, the 2% payroll tax cut set to expire, the alternative minimum tax set to bounce back and affect 30 million families instead of 4 million. If all of that stuff were to happen, it would inevitably have to change economic forecasts significantly.
Yeah, I mean,
so how do you anticipate, or how do you project when there are those unknowns hanging out there in just 10?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great
months?
question, and I'm pretty much in the same position that all of you are in, that you try to do your best in terms of forecasting what's going to get played out along those lines. And you know that there's uncertainties, and you average across the uncertainties as best you can, given that. And so there's nothing to be said beyond that. But certainly, if all of those outcomes hit at once, that would be a drag on growth beyond what's embedded in my forecast.
Yeah, yeah, and that gets to your point about things can change, and
that's absolutely correct. And then the appropriate policy response will change based on that. Yeah.
Other questions? Don?
Yeah. Is anything
Wait for the microphone, and then we can all hear you.
I thought you could hear me before. Anyway, just going back over here, the federal debt to me is by far the biggest problem we have. 16 trillion, it's going up and up and up. When 5 years from now, 10 years from now, if this thing doesn't change, when do we just collapse? I mean, how far can we keep going?
Well, there's just from a straight accounting point of view, and there's a couple of ways to answer that question. I think from a straight accounting point of view, I think the tensions that face the United States are really longer-term ones. There's a demographic pressure that we've got an aging population. We've got a bunch of things we promised to that aging population. And our tax revenues are not sufficient to support that. And something's going to give about that. But that's a longer-term issue. With that said, as a longer-term issue, and many people are critical of our politicians in Washington for not getting on top of this. I actually think it's great to the extent that we've actually started a dialogue, started a conversation well in advance of when we need to. The sooner we can provide clarity about how that's going to be resolved, and I'm certainly not in a position to say how it should be resolved, but the sooner we can provide clarity about whether it's going to be resolved by raising taxes or cutting entitlements or some combination thereof, and if so, if we're going to raise taxes, which taxes, the better we can achieve clarity about that, the better. It doesn't have to mean we have to start doing those things in 2013, but it would be better for all of us as we make our forecasts about what to do to have more clarity about how that's going to be resolved, I would say 5, 10, 15 years down the road.
So very much like the Social Security reform in 1982, where not a lot happened immediately, but we put policies in place that we knew would then occur over time. the
That's
raising
exactly
of
what you're looking
retirement
for.
age gradually, et cetera. At least give us the trajectory.
I mean, yeah, not to say that that's necessarily the right solution to the current problems, but getting on top of them in that way is exactly the right thing to be doing.
Other questions? Joe, just wait for the microphone.
When you look at the unemployment rate at a little over 8% right now, but the real unemployment rate with the number of people dropping out of the market is in the upper teens. How big a factor is that? You know, you say it's going to drop to 7.2, but how many more people are going to drop out of the hunting period? But we don't know that, but you can project. But how big a factor is that? Is this unprecedented based on what we've seen in previous recessions, or is this kind of the norm?
No, this is, we are in, from a post-World War II point of view, these are unprecedented times. The way I think about this is through this fraction of people who are working, so the fraction of the population over 16 who have a job. And that fell from 62.7% in December '07 to a low of about 58.1% in last year, in mid-2011. And it's come up slightly since then to about 58.5%. But your question is, people often ask about what's going to happen to unemployment over the longer term. I have a fair amount of confidence that we will settle down back into a 5 to 6% range for the unemployment rate over a sufficiently long time horizon, say 4 to 5 years. What the employment population ratio will be in that time frame, I feel much less certain about. So that is, you know, how many people will end up leaving the labor force. That terminology is not actually totally accurate. It's a lot of times it's younger people choosing not to enter the workforce, right? That's what's happening instead. If people become 16 and choose not to, or 18 or 20 or 5, choose not to get a job or look for a job. So the question is going to be, that means, that puts more burden on our society. When we have a smaller fraction of the population working, that means that working population has to support more people. And we have to think about what that means. So that is a tremendous source of uncertainty for me going forward about, and it's not, it's a persistent issue. It's been with us, the description of the data I gave you has been something that's been true for quite some time at this point. And I think it's something we should be thinking about. This might be something that might be around for a relatively long period of time.
Is a piece of that people who are closer to retirement age that are leaving the workplace simply because they found a way to get by without returning to employment?
You know, there's lots of different pieces going on, but even if you look at the age group from 25 to 54,
it's evident there as well.
It's evident there as well, yes.
I was going to ask, and I think you've already answered this, but I want to be sure I'm clear, and maybe there are others that need clarity as well. This development of the unemployment rate coming down largely because of fewer people being eligible or available to work or making themselves available to work did I hear you say that is somewhat unprecedented as a factor in reducing unemployment?
I should be clear about what I'm saying is unprecedented. The slowness of the employment population ratio to recover is unprecedented in post-war recoveries. Yeah.
Can you share just a few thoughts about what sets Minnesota's economy apart? Because I think your remarks a couple months ago on the state of Minnesota's economy delineated some ways in which we have been different than, and in some respects better than what's going on now.
Well, certainly our outcomes have been gratifying ones. Unemployment started about the same level as it was nationally in December '07, but it ended up peaking at around 8.5%. So below that 10% number I gave for the national number is only 8.5% in Minnesota. And now our unemployment rate is down to I think 5.7%. So well, again, still well below the nation as a whole. So I wouldn't say our economy is fully recovered by any means, but on the other hand, I think we're further along the path of recovery than the nation as a whole is. Why is that? I think there are a couple of different reasons. One is I think our education levels are higher than the rest of the country, and if you go by education groups, the people who have more education have been able to been more buffered against the effects of the recession than people who have had less education. And Minnesotans are more educated, so that's a positive. There's a little bit less of the boom-bust cycle in real estate. There's certainly some of it in Minnesota, but there's a little less of that going on. So I think both of those are relevant factors. But to be honest, we're still trying to figure out why Minnesota was more successful in this time frame. Usually Minnesota is a very diverse economy. It's I think more diversified than some of our friends on the coast might realize about us. So we tend to track the national economy very closely. And here we did in direction, but not anywhere close in magnitudes. And we're still working on trying to figure out exactly why. But I think the things I pointed to, education and a lack of as severe a boom-bust cycle in real estate, I think both of those matter.
How about agriculture?
Well, agriculture, it's very good in this state, and there's no doubt about that. The share of agriculture in the Minnesota economy is not all that different from what it would be nationally. And it's always a surprise to hear that, and I was surprised to learn that when I became president, because one of my jobs was to learn about the 9th District and our economy. But we are very diversified, which is something that ends up meaning we track the nation pretty closely as a result.